Hi, folks. Welcome to Walking on the Weene Side, part of It Matters Radio. And today I have a wonderful guest on. She's written 2 books, one of which, of course, as you know, I always read. The central book I have on is called Flying Jenny. And it is a fun, exciting, interesting read by today's guest, Theasa Tuohy. And Theasa, welcome to Walking on the Weene Side.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here and delighted to be with an interviewer who's read the book and loves it.
Now, this book, I want to tell people, this book is set in 1929, but the earlier part of 1929, and it starts out with a rather dramatic piece of history about flying. And I don't know how many people in the audience have ever been up in a small plane, like a 2-seater. I have. I actually was given the controls. Terrified the poor pilot. I have no depth perception. As we dove down for Teterboro Airport, he said, "Ken, pull up, pull up." And then he grabbed the stick. I've also been up in a glider, but they didn't even let me near that stick.
Oh, wow.
But anyway, in the beginning of this novel, there is somebody up in a plane. What kind of plane is that?
In the book, it's a Jenny, which was a JN-4. It was a Curtiss airplane, and it was used as a trainer for World War I pilots. Mm-hmm. It's the plane that many of the barnstormers used for lots of reasons. It was very maneuverable. It was cheap as war surplus, and just very easy to fly.
Yeah.
So my character is flying a Jenny, a JN-4. But in point of fact, when this was actually done historically, the woman was flying a Waco.
The woman who did what you're describing in this opening. And I appreciate your honesty in identifying the difference between writing history and writing historical fiction right up.
Oh, wow, yeah.
But what is it that woman does? What does she do that is so remarkable?
She took off from Roosevelt Field on Long Island and flew under all 4 East River bridges.
Yeah.
The 4 bridges that connect Manhattan to Queens and Brooklyn. And no one had ever done it before, and no one's ever done it since. It was a very, very, very difficult thing to do, almost impossible.
And very dangerous.
Oh, my Lord. I mean, there's, at some points, there's not much more than 200 feet between the bridge, some of those bridges, some space on the bridges and the water.
Oh, yeah. Well, having lived in New York and having gone over every one of those bridges and looked down, when I was reading it, and I was reading the description, your excellent description of her popping up between the bridges and then going down, I really could visualize it and imagine it, and I felt my own heart kind of going, ah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
No, it was an amazing stunt.
Yeah. Roosevelt Field, by the way, folks, if that reminds you of something else about flying, Roosevelt Field was, of course, the field from which Lindbergh took off to cross the Atlantic. And it's named not for Franklin Roosevelt, who wasn't anything important at this point, nor was it named for Franklin's cousin Theodore, who of course had been president of the United States. It was named for Theodore's son, who had been, in fact, an aviator during the First World War. And now, of course, it's a shopping mall.
Yeah, it's a Macy's. I mean,
At the Macy's.
people say something about Roosevelt Field, and I say, I'm not talking about Macy's,
Right. But in those days, back then, it was really in nowhere. It was part of Long Island that, it was considered way outside the city.
Well, yeah.
And it was one of the few really established airports, planes. There were really almost no airports as such in America then. In fact, one of the great things you point out is that a lot of times people would take off and land, and there wouldn't be a runway as such, and people would be out in the way. They'd be taking off through a field, and people come running out in the way to look,
Yeah. No. That was what was one of the many things that was so much fun about writing that book, was getting into the old press reports, the press accounts of how fascinated the public was with flying, and the crazy things not only the barnstormers did, but the spectators did. I mean, the spectators were running out on the field and doing everything under the sun to get a good look. They had no idea. In fact, another thing that I mentioned in the book, when we talk about the Powder Puff Derby, which is why I set the book in 1929, because that was the first time women were allowed into the transcontinental air races.
Right.
And during that race, one of the contestants, a woman by the name of Pancho Barnes, who was a total character in her own right, she landed right on a spectator's car. I mean, these people were just nuts over flying. They were just out there running around, lining the fields, lining the race ended in Cleveland, and there were all these people sitting on roofs in Cleveland watching these women come in.
Yeah.
It's a fun time in history. It really was.
Now, just before we get on, you mentioned barnstorming. We haven't talked about that, and I really want to get to barnstorming in a minute. But before we do that, I want to talk about your other main character. One of your main characters, and by the way, the flyer's name is Jenny, which I thought was a lovely pickup. But then you have another main character, and her name is, I believe,
Laura Bailey.
Yeah, and Laura Bailey is also breaking new ground as a woman. She is a reporter, which is something you're very familiar with, aren't you?
Yes, I spent my whole adult working life as a reporter. I worked for 5 daily newspapers and for the Associated Press.
Mm-hmm. And were you relegated to covering women's issues, or did you get the full range of...
No, I resisted that at every turn. At one point when I was out of a job, I had come back from Europe, just sort of bumming around, and I was out of a job and was called and offered a job on the women's pages at the Detroit Free Press, at the Detroit News. And I said, I'm sorry, I just don't think I could handle that. I've never covered anything but news. And sure enough, I waited another 2 weeks, and I got a job offer as the first woman assistant city editor at that same newspaper. So it pays off to not take type, not take shorthand, and
yeah. You are old enough so that you really were during that transition. Of course, we still have newspapers that have women's pages, and they're concerned with certain kinds of things. But there are plenty of women who now are on regular news. But Laura is really a pioneer. She's a trailblazer.
Yeah, she really was.
Yeah. And she goes out and takes real risk. And one of the real risks is she ends up chasing this barnstorming circuit. So what is barnstorming? And what does that name come from? That's by itself is interesting.
Well, you're asking me a question I'm not sure I can answer. it was mainly that these guys that had bought these old war surplus Jennies just sort of, I guess, flew from barn to barn. I mean, they went out, they did, they took people up for airplane rides. Still, I found old pictures where it shows, you could take a ride for $1.
Mm-hmm.
But also, they would take people up and put parachutes on them and let them jump if they wanted to. So,
and they'd also put on a performance usually before that to just thrill the crowd, which people might or might not pay to come and stand in the field. But they call it barnstorming. It really was farm storming because they go from farm from
exactly.
farm.
I mean, that's what I'm saying, from barn to barn, or
and they would go and they put on these shows, and they really they were doing some pretty hairy stuff, especially since they didn't have proper safety equipment. Navigational equipment, or a lot of the stuff that makes flying a lot safer now.
Oh yeah, I mean, they were those old airplanes. I don't know if you can imagine even what they looked like. The place where they would sit, the cockpit, was like nothing more than a hole in the fuselage. Mm-hmm. My mother was a pilot in the late 29, early 30s. And at one point I did a story for her for a story about her for the Associated Press. And I went with her to look at old airplanes, and I was just absolutely flabbergasted to see what they sat in. I mean, it was sort of like a hole in a tin can,
And if the woman was small, there really
like my mother.
Very little holding her in, because the seat belting. Nowadays we have all these wonderful kind of seat belts for in the car and an automobile. In those days, I mean, she was just kind of lucky. She might have to sit in a phone book or something to get her up enough so that the seat belt would cinch on her.
Yeah, my mother flew with a pillow behind her because she was afraid she'd fall out when they were flying upside down.
So, let's get back to this in a moment, folks, but first, this. Welcome back to Walking on the Weene Side. Theasa, you haven't gone up on any of those open cockpit planes, have you, yourself?
No, good Lord, no. But I don't know how many people have anymore. I mean, those old airplanes are still around. They fix them up like old cars or something like that and put them in an air show.
Right.
I was at an air show in Rhinebeck, at the Rhinebeck Aerodome, and they had a bunch of wonderful stunt pilots that were up flying those old airplanes. But That's
and they're still pretty maneuverable. Well, one of the things that I got me in your book, there was a reverend, because you bring in all these other pilots, and they're barnstorming around, and wow, there's one point where the guy is stealing back his own plane, and all kinds of fun stuff.
Yeah.
Folks, there's a lot of fun in this book. Okay, I'm not going to spoil
that actually happened. That stealing of the airplane.
I'm not going to give you too much because I want you to read the book, but it's really kind of funny. And there's also one of these barnstormers who flew around with a lion in his plane, which I thought was really cool. But anyway, going back to this, there is one point that I thought was very interesting because there is a disagreement over whether it's better to fly in an enclosed cockpit, because they were enclosed. They were now developing these more advanced planes, bigger planes. Whether it's better to fly in an enclosed cockpit or basically to be in the open air and have that experience. And what struck me is there is poetry written by people who have flown, obviously. I can't quote any of it off the top of my head, but about how close to God people felt when they were flying. And I remember Saint-Exupéry was one I remember writing about. And I think they were probably writing about these open cockpits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
And then I was thinking about now, in this day and age, of course, the people who are doing something similar, we call them astronauts or cosmonauts, and they're flying out to the moon, and they're looking out and seeing the Earth below, and suddenly are aware of the whole notion of creation, the beauty of the universe, and again, feeling close to what they believe is God. And the thing that strikes me is how similar an experience, whether it's being the first person you know of anyway to climb to the top of a mountain, to the first person to go down in a bathoscope into the bottom of the sea, the first person to fly in an open cockpit high above and feel like a bird, the first person to zoom up into the stratosphere. There is something about the human spirit that is wonderful, awe-inspiring. And now let's just go back and talk a little bit more about the feminist side of Flying Jenny. By the way, I just want to mention this is published by Akashic Books, and it is a Kaylee Jones book.
Kaylee Jones imprint.
Imprint, yeah, it is one of her imprints. And they've done a wonderful job, I think, including, just a nicely, easily readable book. That's not so easy to do, to publish a nice, readable, clean book. And by the way, that's what the cover looks like, folks.
Okay.
Okay. So this is also very much a feminist book. Was that part of your intent?
Yes and no. The sort of my initial point in starting it was that women have been doing interesting, fun, serious things for a long time. So I found examples of women in 1929 that were defying the odds in all kinds of different ways. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you would call that exactly feminist. It was more, here we are and this is what we can do.
But isn't that what feminism is?
I guess.
I mean, real feminism isn't writing theoretical books about
right.
the equality. It's about showing that women is able to do the things men are able to do, and there are, that it shouldn't, the gender should not define the world and their possibilities.
Exactly. I mean, my feeling is go do it if you want to.
But now Laura's mother goes a step beyond that. And I wondered if you'd like to talk a little bit about Laura's mother's worldview and what's going on with her. Because she defines not just woman, but she defines bohemian.
Exactly. And that, again, is just as the woman in the newspaper business, the woman pilot, they're totally accurate, historically accurate. So is Laura's mother and that time in Greenwich Village in the teens, actually, when Laura was born. Mm-hmm. All the stuff in there is historically accurate about those poets and so-called forward thinkers. They declared Greenwich Village a free republic. It was a crazy time, and it was a lot of fun for me to do the historical research to get all of that accurate. Mm-hmm. Laura's mother had all sorts of lovers, all these famous poets and writers.
Male and female.
Yes, as a matter of fact. I think I even threw Isadora Duncan in there.
Yes, you did, which I enjoyed very much, the reference to Isadora, especially because, of course, then we think of people flying in those days, we think of them with their long scarves, and of course that was a wonderful play on Isadora Duncan.
Isadora's.
Because of the long scarf.
Yeah.
So is this the sense that not only can women do things in the world of work, but that they should have the same freedom, the same right to be sexual, the same right to be real, the same right to be active? I
don't think I was making a philosophical statement there. I was being a reporter and describing the way things were in the village in those days. And even to some extent today. I mean, the difference between Jenny and Laura, and this is why they continually clashed, was that they grew up with a very different sense of what was right and what was wrong and how the world should be.
Interestingly enough, though, Laura's mother never really helped Laura to find her own femininity, her own womanhood, which of course is where their friendship becomes something that really makes, in my mind, the novel work beautifully, because they learn from each other, they grow from each other in a wonderful way. But I just want to mention, before we leave Flying Jenny, the book that I did read, and start talking about the one I haven't yet read but hope to. Before we make that transition, I want to talk about the mystery here. There is a mystery that underlies this story. Well, I don't want to do, again, spoiler alert, we don't want to do that. But Laura does not know who she is on her father's side. Her mother has never revealed her parentage on her father's, on who the father was, and what his background was. And this is haunting Laura. And I wondered, when you were creating Laura in your mind as a character, was that why Laura became a reporter?
That's an interesting question, but no, not in my mind. I don't think so. She was a reporter because I was a reporter, and because that was a wonderful way for a woman to do what she wanted to do. Mm-hmm. The quest for her father was in my mind just kind of a different issue the issue of what her work was. Although I don't think this is a spoiler work, that the work did ultimately help her solve that.
Oh, yeah, she did resolve it. And a very interesting paternity it is. And beyond that, folks, I don't want to, again, you really ought to read Flying Jenny by Theasa Tuohy, and you'll find out the answer to who Laura's father was, and you'll enjoy finding out. But I do want to I do want to mention one other little subset, just a whole other topic that you bring up in the book, because personally it fascinated me. You bring up Native American issues, and particularly with regard to the Osage Indians, who, of course, you originally were born in Oklahoma, and the Osage came from that part of the world. And you introduce some issues about oil rights and hereditary rights and tribal membership and human dignity. And again, I'm not going to ask you too much about it, just to say to folks, I learned something, and people know on the show know it. I had many Native American on the show. We've talked about Native American issues, and yet I was still learning.
Good. That makes me happy.
Yeah. But I was wondering, did you include that in the book because it is an issue that you have dealt with in other areas? Or how did you come by your personal interest in, if you have a story behind it, in the Osage and in that whole issue of how people were stealing the oil rights and killing one another over the oil and all that?
I heard some of those stories as a child from my father about the Osage. My parents had a very good friend named Mary Aaron, whose grandmother was a full-blooded Osage. So I'd heard these stories, and the story that I included in there about the circuit riding priest coming to the house of one of the characters, I had heard about Mary Aaron's grandmother.
Uh-huh.
So a lot of the stories I heard as a child, both about my mother flying and about the Osage, I was able to work into the story, and that was one more reason that the book was fun for me.
Now, folks, we're going to be right back after this, and when we come back, we're going to be talking about Theasa's other book, her earlier book, which I haven't read, as I said, but which sounds to me like it's something I definitely want to read. And we'll be right back. Welcome back, folks, to Walking on the Weene Side. And we have been talking about this excellent book. It's called Flying Jenny, and it's by my guest today, Theasa Tuohy. But Theasa, you have an earlier book, a novel that you've written. It's called The 5 O'Clock Follies. Why don't you tell us a little about it?
It's a novelistic, fictionally, historically accurate, again, story about a woman war correspondent during the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. I did the same thing with that I did with Flying Jenny, and that was just learn everything I possibly could about the situation and then stick my fictional character into the book. Mm-hmm. That was my first book, and that was really my first love in terms of writing fiction.
Mm-hmm. And it takes place. Have you been to Vietnam?
I've been there, but I was not there as a correspondent. I went there after I'd done my research to just triple check that I really had everything right. The book is set during a very small period of time, from October 1967 to about April of 1968, so that I could cover the Tet Offensive. The woman war correspondent went there on her own, paid her own way. And that was one of the things that first absolutely fascinated me about this, was that the many so-called journalists went to Vietnam just for the heck of it and to cover a war. It wasn't at all like the Second World War or like any war we've ever had since. It was just chaos in terms of who could cover the war. Mm-hmm. So the book I started out with, I found in the slush pile when I was working at Newsday on Long Island. And it was a tome, huge study, by a guy by the name of Peter Braystrup, who had been a reporter in Vietnam and had also been a Marine. And he set out basically to prove that the press had lost the war in Vietnam. So my book does not have any political position about that whatsoever. But the thing was, it was an incredible resource for me, because he went from battle to battle to battle to battle and described write-throughs from the AP, for example. The AP would send out a story that said such, and 3 minutes later, the Washington Post would send out a story about such and such, so that he had done this incredibly detailed study of the press. So it was an ideal resource for me to get myself started and into that situation. I still to this day have the map that I copied out of his book that showed where Agence France-Presse was, where the AP was, where Reuters' office was. So I had an absolute map of downtown Saigon that showed where all the reporters lived and worked. So it was an amazing story for me to just follow the activity of the reporters during the Tet Offensive. And of course there's romance, and of course there's it's a novel, but it's, and as nearly as I can tell, it seems to be practically the only story, a fictionalized account of what the reporter's life was like, what the press operated like. All the reporters that had been there as correspondents
were memoirs.
wrote, exactly, you're right. They all wrote memoirs. Nobody thought about writing fiction about it.
Mhm.
So it kind of put me in a different category of being a journalist and knowing the inside workings of journalism, and yet writing a fictionalized account. The good fiction that came out of Vietnam was all written by the military.
Yes.
Was all written by guys on the ground, by
things
soldiers.
they carried.
Exactly.
Oh,
there you go.
What a piece
yeah.
of work.
Yeah. Yeah. Going after Cacciato was his first.
Yeah.
But
what is the title referred to? It's a very straight. The 5 o'clock Follies. Why 5 o'clock?
That's what the press called the briefings that were given by the military at the Rex Hotel at 5 o'clock every afternoon. The military would call the press into a auditorium at the Rex Hotel and give them a lot of body counts and stuff like that. That the press, that war was a real conflict between the press and the military.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why they called it the Follies,
mm-hmm.
because they didn't accept everything that they were handed there.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I ran into a PIO, a press information officer, at a book signing. Actually, it was a guy I had worked with at Newsday, but didn't know terribly well, and didn't realize that he had been a press information officer for the military in Saigon
Mm-hmm.
at the time. And he told me they went so far as to seriously think about changing the time of the briefing, so they had quit making fun of it and call it, so they couldn't call it the 5 o'clock Follies.
So
anymore.
They call it the 5:15 Follies.
Right.
And that's one of the things I love about our military. They never get, they are so bound into the small detail that they never get the bigger abstraction, which is that the press, of course, had come to disbelieve what the military was telling them.
Right,
and
exactly.
Largely based on reality. I mean, a lot of what the military was saying was ridiculous, but also based on that belief that if we say it, it must be true.
Right.
And as soon as you get that, a good reporter smells that. A good reporter says, wait a minute, you're convincing yourself rather than doing real factual unfolding. And that was, So you and I are great believers in the job of journalism.
Well, I am.
Well, I am. Okay. I don't know if you know it or not, but one of my novels, which is called Times to Try the Soul of Man, is set in New York.
No, I didn't.
And it is about a reporter. It's based on a friend of mine who actually was the reporter. I mean, I fictionalized him and changed him in a lot of ways personally, but he was the reporter behind this particular story. And, one of the things that we came to realize as I got involved later on in the story was that he and a few other people in the press were the only ones who really wanted the truth. And I think that's something that really journalism is about. It's about truth. I think that's something I want to say, journalism and fiction have that in common. Because as you now must know from writing 2 very good novels, well, I know one of them, I read one of them, I'm going to guess the second one. Sounds like it's a very good novel too. That you get to truth often in art, not by reporting every detail, but capturing the sense of and the authenticity of. And in journalism, of course, you're bound to make sure all the details are accurate.
Right.
But both of them are a way of searching for truth. that press releases and communiques often fail.
Yes. Yes. Now, speaking of Tim O'Brien, and when we were, you mentioned the things they carry, and I mentioned going after Cacciato. I went to I don't know, I guess it was a workshop, a week of studying fiction at Swanee, the University of the South, where Tim O'Brien was one of the lecturers. Oh. And we were all given pink T-shirts with a sign on the back in black ink that said, "Just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't true."
Yep. And that is, really important to remember, folks, because truth is real truth, the truth that really makes a difference in our lives, often is not just about what happened, but how we understand the world.
Exactly.
And that's why I think, it's interesting, as we've talked today particularly about Flying Jenny, that for me, a lot of the truth of Flying Jenny was not something that you set out to include in it. Particularly the sense of feminism and that you really come across as having written a very feminist novel, and yet that wasn't your intent at all. Because when you write well, and you have written well, truth comes to the reader. And I congratulate you for that.
Oh, thank you. That's lovely to hear. It's really lovely to hear. You're just trying to capture the way it was at the time and how people felt about things.
Now, if people want to capture more about you, obviously they can go on Amazon and buy your books or order them from Barnes or whatever. But there are local bookstores if they can still find a local bookstore.
Yeah, exactly.
But can they find out more about you, like on the social media? Do you have a website?
Yes, I have. I'm trying to get all that stuff. I wasn't much a social media person before this started, but I've got a website that's my name, because my name is so different, so unusual. It's just real simple, theasatuohy.com.
I better spell that for you folks. Theasa is Theasa, and Tuohy is spelled Tuohy. Both my books are on there. I have a public Facebook page. I have a Twitter account, and I'm starting to do get a YouTube site where I will be delighted to have this interview. I understand that will be put on YouTube. Absolutely, it will be on YouTube, and of course both as at It Matters Radio and Walking on the Weene side, and obviously I'm delighted to hear it will be on your site as well. And I am really just so happy that you joined me today, Theasa, and I want again to mention, folks, I read a lot of books. People are always sending me books. Publicists send them, authors send them, and I read a lot of them. That doesn't mean I interview their authors. I only interview the authors of books that I honestly can say, this is worth reading. Flying Jenny, a novel by Theasa Tuohy. I'm going to tell you, folks, it's a book worth your time. And please pick up a copy and enjoy.
Thank you so much. This has just been really fun.
The Ripeness of Fruit by Kenneth Weene. Vajra wakes. The sun is not yet up. The cock has not yet cawed. Perhaps it was the hoot of loons, the stirring of goats in the barn, the restless wandering of the wind among the budding cherry trees. Does the wind taste the tart ripeness of the fruit, she wonders? She bends to the fire. Charcoal is dear and they have little. Badria tries to ignore the cold of her hands, the chill that sneaks beneath her heaviest robe. The fire must be used to heat water for Farzam's tea, to heat the rice for his breakfast. For Badria's part, cold water will do. Whatever warmth lays hidden in yesterday's rice pot will suffice. But Farzam's tea. Where does the winter go, she asks herself, when the earth comes back to life, when the nights again are warm and the days glow with heat and desire? Perhaps the teacher who has come to the village knows the answer to such questions. She would ask him if allowed, but Badria is not allowed. Women do not speak to men, not even to teachers, particularly not to teachers. It is written, that is enough. The spark catches, the handful of straw flares, a corner of the rich charcoal smolders. While the red heat spreads, she fetches water from the well. The water is clear and cold. She uses some to wash her face. The hem of her garment serves as washcloth. As Badria walks, the wet corner clings to her leg. She giggles. Sensation is enough to bring laughter or tears. Badria's body sings. It is the song of life. How could it be otherwise? Even at 11 years, she is woman. Even at 11 years, the child within her blooms. It is written, that is enough. Farzam will soon wake. Where is my tea? He will bellow. She will have it ready. He will be pleased. He will not hit her. He will not curse her father for a bad deal. He will not demand the 3 goats back. She will be worth the price.